There are many ways a father can divide a farm between his children, but nobody in Carter County had ever heard of anyone dividing it this way. When Thomas Carter died, he didn't ask his sons to choose between the north field and the south field, the larger barn or the smaller one, or even the richer soil and the poorer soil. Instead, he left them with two keys resting on the lawyer's desk. One opened the door of a nearly new John Deere. The other belonged to an old Farmall that had faithfully worked the Carter farm for more than 40 years. His final instruction puzzled everyone in the room, because before either brother could claim a single acre of land, each had to choose one tractor, and only then would the land be divided. The room fell silent as both brothers stared at the keys, because nobody could understand why an experienced farmer would allow two machines to decide the future of 400 acres. To almost everyone present, the decision seemed obvious. One tractor represented the future, the other appeared to belong in the past. Yet Thomas Carter had never confused age with value, and the people who knew him best quietly suspected he was teaching one final lesson that neither of his sons yet understood. 5 years later, both brothers would finally discover that their father had never asked them to choose between two tractors at all. There are some questions a family answers in a single afternoon, while others quietly shape the rest of their lives. Daniel and Luke Carter believed they were making one simple decision on the day their father's will was read, yet neither of them realized that the choice waiting on the lawyer's desk had already begun, changing the kind of farmers they would become, long before either brother turned a single key. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so leave your town, state, or country in the comments below. One of my favorite parts of this channel is seeing people from farming communities and small towns all around the world come together to share their stories. I'm also putting together a free Last Acre story archive featuring 25 forgotten rural stories, the real historical inspirations behind many of our videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, fascinating historical discoveries, and exclusive story ideas you won't find on the channel. I'll be sharing it first through the Community tab, so if you'd like to receive it when it becomes available, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you don't miss the announcement. Now, let's go back to the afternoon the Carter family gathered inside a small lawyer's office, because that's where this story truly begins. It didn't begin with two tractors, 400 acres of farmland, or even a father's will. It began with one final decision from a man who understood that the greatest inheritance he could leave his sons wasn't something they could own. It was something they would have to earn. Few people in Jackson County could remember a time when Thomas Carter's opinion wasn't worth listening to, because he had spent more than 50 years proving that good farming depended as much on sound judgment as it did on hard work. Whenever neighbors argued about machinery, crop rotations, or whether a piece of land was worth buying, Thomas rarely rushed to offer an answer. Instead, he listened carefully, asked a few thoughtful questions, and somehow helped people discover the answer for themselves. That quiet habit earned him something far more valuable than a reputation for being successful, because it earned the trust of an entire farming community, and by the time family and friends gathered after his funeral, most people believed Thomas had already passed everything he knew on to his two sons. Although Daniel and Luke Carter had been raised on the same farm by the same father, they had grown into very different men because each of them had learned a different lesson while working beside Thomas. Daniel admired his father's determination to keep improving, and he believed modern farming demanded better equipment, greater efficiency, and the confidence to embrace new opportunities before other farmers did. Luke admired something entirely different because he paid closer attention whenever Thomas repaired an old machine instead of replacing it, walked a field before deciding how to work it, or quietly reminded him that a farmer should understand every tool he depended on. Neither brother believed the other was wrong, and despite their different ways of thinking, they had always worked side by side with mutual respect rather than rivalry. When the Carter family gathered inside the lawyer's office later that afternoon, everyone expected the reading of the will to follow a familiar pattern because Thomas owned nearly 400 acres of productive farmland, several barns, a healthy cattle operation, and enough machinery to keep 2 farms running successfully for many years. Most assumed the land would simply be divided fairly before each brother continued farming in his own way, yet the lawyer paused after reading the opening pages of the will and explained that Thomas had left one instruction that neither he nor anyone else had the authority to change because every other decision depended upon it. Without saying another word, the lawyer reached beneath the desk and placed 2 keys on the polished wooden table between the brothers. One key belonged to a nearly new John Deere that Thomas had purchased only a few seasons earlier after saving for years to afford it, while the other belonged to the old Farmall that had faithfully served the Carter family for more than 40 years. Several people in the room exchanged puzzled glances because the choice hardly seemed fair at first. One tractor represented modern farming with greater horsepower, modern technology, and the ability to accomplish in hours what older machines often required days to finish, while the other represented a lifetime of memories attached to equipment that many believed had already given everything it had left to give. The lawyer finally broke the silence by reading Thomas's final instruction exactly as it appeared on the page. Before either son could receive a single acre of land, each of them would choose 1 tractor, and only after both keys had been claimed would the rest of the estate be divided according to Thomas's written wishes. Nobody questioned whether the instruction should be followed because everyone in the room knew Thomas Carter well enough to understand that he never asked people to do something without a reason, even if that reason wasn't immediately obvious. Daniel looked toward the John Deere almost as soon as the lawyer finished reading because the decision seemed perfectly sensible to him. A modern farm required modern equipment, and he couldn't imagine his father expecting him to build the future with a tractor that belonged to the past. Luke remained silent for several moments as his eyes settled on the old Farmall, remembering long winter evenings spent handing his father wrenches, replacing worn bearings, and listening to conversations that somehow turned simple repairs into lessons about far more than machinery. Even so, he couldn't explain why those memories mattered at a moment when logic seemed to point so clearly in the opposite direction. After a long silence, Daniel reached forward with quiet confidence and picked up the John Deere key. Luke waited until his brother had made his choice before slowly wrapping his fingers around the worn leather tag attached to the Farmall key, and although several people in the room looked genuinely surprised by his decision, one elderly neighbor, sitting quietly near the back, lowered his eyes, smiled almost to himself, and whispered so softly that only the lawyer sitting beside him heard the words, "Tom's still teaching them." Neither brother noticed. The weeks following the reading of Thomas Carter's will passed more quickly than either brother expected because farming has always demanded attention to the season ahead rather than the season behind. Before long, the land had been divided according to their father's instructions. New fence lines quietly marked the boundaries between the 2 farms, and Daniel and Luke found themselves beginning the first planting season of their lives without the man whose footsteps had guided them since childhood. Although they now worked separate fields, neither brother viewed the other as a competitor because Thomas had spent years teaching them that the land was difficult enough without turning family into an opponent. Daniel settled into his new routine with confidence because the nearly new John Deere allowed him to cover more ground in less time than ever before. Work that once required careful planning could now be finished in a single day. Larger implements made field preparation faster and more efficient, and before long, several neighbors commented that Daniel's operation already looked like one of the most progressive farms in the county. They admired his willingness to embrace modern equipment because agriculture was changing rapidly, and most believed Thomas would have been proud to see his oldest son preparing the farm for the future rather than holding on to the past. Luke's farm told a different story, although not necessarily a worse one. The old Farmall rarely hurried through a day's work, and there were mornings when it seemed determined to remind him that 40 years of faithful service had earned the right to demand a little patience. Whenever a belt needed adjusting, a bearing began making an unfamiliar sound, or an oil seal started leaking, Luke never reached for a telephone because he instinctively reached for the toolbox his father had left hanging on the workshop wall. He spent long evenings repairing small problems before they became expensive ones, gradually learning that every machine speaks through vibration, sound, and feel long before it ever refuses to start. And as the months passed, the old Farmall slowly stopped feeling like an inheritance and began feeling like a partner whose language he was finally beginning to understand. Even so, there were moments when Luke questioned whether he had made the right decision, because he watched Daniel finish jobs more quickly, plant more acres in a day, and accept additional custom work from neighboring farms that Luke simply didn't have time to complete. On those evenings, he sometimes found himself wondering whether he had allowed memories of his father to outweigh practical judgment, and although he never admitted those doubts aloud, they quietly followed him across the fields more often than he cared to acknowledge. One evening near the end of harvest, the brothers met beside the old fence line their father had walked hundreds of times over the years. Daniel climbed down from the John Deere with a smile and joked that their father probably never imagined Luke would still be depending on a tractor old enough to qualify for the county parade instead of everyday field work. Luke laughed because the comment carried more affection than criticism, and after brushing a little grease from his hands, he looked toward the Farmall before answering in the same easy spirit. "Dad used to say a machine talks long before it quits. You just have to learn its language." Daniel smiled politely because he had heard the saying many times growing up, although it sounded no different from the dozens of other lessons their father had repeated over the years. Luke looked across the fields for a moment before quietly adding, "He also said the day a farmer stops understanding his tools is the day he starts depending on someone else's understanding instead." Daniel nodded, still smiling, because he assumed his father had simply been encouraging both of them to take better care of their equipment. The conversation soon drifted toward the coming harvest, the price of corn, and plans for the next season, while neither brother realized that Thomas Carter's old saying had already begun shaping both of their lives in ways they wouldn't fully understand for several more years. 5 years passed more quickly than either brother expected because the seasons never slowed down long enough for anyone to notice how gradually small decisions became lasting habits. By the autumn of 2003, Daniel Carter had earned a reputation as one of Jackson County's most progressive young farmers because each successful harvest allowed him to lease a little more land, invest in better equipment, and complete work faster than many of his neighbors. People often pointed to his operation as proof that Thomas Carter's oldest son understood exactly where modern agriculture was heading, and whenever conversations turned toward efficiency or growth, Daniel's name was usually mentioned with quiet admiration. Luke's farm followed a very different path, although he never seemed troubled by the comparison. His acreage remained smaller, The old Farmall continued working through every season with its familiar steady rhythm, and the workshop behind his barn gradually became as important to him as the fields themselves, because every winter he carefully repaired, adjusted, and maintained the equipment he already owned, instead of replacing it. Some neighbors wondered why he refused to modernize more quickly, while others simply smiled and remarked that Luke sounded more like Thomas with every passing year. The brothers still saw each other often because the old property line had never become a wall between them. They shared meals during harvest, helped each other move cattle whenever an extra pair of hands was needed, and laughed about many of the same childhood stories they had heard from their father. Although they occasionally disagreed about machinery or farming methods, neither man believed the other had chosen the wrong path because both farms were providing a good living, and from the outside, Thomas Carter's unusual inheritance appeared to have worked exactly as everyone hoped. That impression changed during the first week of harvest when Daniel climbed into the John Deere before sunrise, expecting another long but productive day. The engine started normally, the machine rolled only a short distance into the field, and then an unfamiliar warning appeared on the display before the tractor quietly shut itself down. Daniel tried restarting it several times, checked everything he could think of, and even searched through the operator's manual. Yet nothing brought the machine back to life because the problem wasn't something he could see or repair from the cab. With every passing minute, the growing field around him became harder to ignore because the weather forecast had changed overnight, and several days of heavy rain were now expected before the end of the week. Daniel finally reached for his phone and called the dealership, hoping the problem would be simple enough to solve over the telephone, but after listening carefully to his description, the service manager apologized and explained that the tractor would require a technician with specialized diagnostic equipment. The earliest appointment available was 3 days away because crews across the county were already responding to breakdowns as harvest reached its busiest period. And although the manager promised to come as soon as possible, Daniel understood that 3 days was a very long time when every hour of dry weather mattered. As he lowered the phone and looked across the waiting rows of corn, another sound drifted across the fields from the neighboring property. It was slower, quieter, and far less powerful than the machine standing silently beside him, yet Daniel recognized it immediately because he had listened to it since childhood. The steady rhythm of the old Farmall echoed across the valley as Luke continued harvesting without interruption, and for the first time since the day they chose their father's tractors, Daniel found himself wondering whether Thomas Carter had seen something neither of his sons had understood 5 years earlier. Daniel spent the next hour doing everything he knew to do, because experience teaches farmers to eliminate the simple problems before accepting the difficult ones. He checked the fuel system, inspected the wiring he could reach, replaced a fuse that looked suspicious, and carefully worked through every suggestion the dealership had offered over the telephone. Yet each attempt ended exactly where the previous one had, because the John Deere refused to move more than a few feet before shutting itself down again. As the morning slipped away, Daniel found himself looking less at the tractor and more at the sky, because the forecast now called for 2 days of steady rain, and every acre left standing in the field represented a risk his father would never have accepted without a fight. Luke noticed something was wrong long before his brother called, because he could see the John Deere sitting in the same place each time he turned the Farmall at the end of his rows. After finishing the field he was working, he drove across the property line, climbed down from the old tractor, and asked the only question that mattered. "How bad is it?" Daniel explained everything the dealership had told him before admitting that the earliest technician wouldn't arrive for another 3 days. He wasn't angry with the dealership because he understood they were helping dozens of farmers facing similar problems, but he also knew the weather wouldn't wait for anyone's schedule. Luke listened without interrupting, looked once toward the dark clouds beginning to gather along the western horizon, and quietly said, "Then let's save the crop first. We'll worry about the tractor after." Daniel hesitated for only a moment because accepting help from his younger brother wasn't difficult. What troubled him was knowing Luke would lose valuable time on his own harvest if he stopped to help someone else's. Before he could object, Luke simply smiled and reminded him that their father had never measured a successful harvest by the number of acres one man finished alone. He measured it by whether the family brought the crop home before the weather changed, and that had always been enough for him. The rest of the afternoon unfolded much the way it had years earlier, when the brothers still farmed side by side with their father, because Luke harvested while Daniel hauled grain, watched moisture levels, prepared the next field, and kept everything moving without either of them needing to say very much. The old Farmall certainly wasn't the fastest machine in the county, yet it never missed a beat because Luke understood every sound it made, every adjustment it occasionally needed, and every small piece of maintenance that kept tomorrow's problems from becoming today's emergencies. As daylight slowly gave way to evening, the last wagon rolled safely into the yard only a short time before the first heavy drops of rain began striking the barn roof. After parking the Farmall inside the machine shed, Luke reached automatically for the grease gun and a clean shop rag before beginning the same routine his father had followed at the end of every long harvest day. Daniel leaned quietly against the doorway, watching his brother wipe away dust, check bearings, tighten a loose belt, and grease fittings that many people would have ignored until something eventually failed. Smiling to himself, he finally asked whether Luke still went through that entire routine every single night after all these years, and Luke nodded without looking up, because the answer had never changed. "Dad used to say tomorrow's breakdown usually begins with the maintenance you skipped today." Daniel laughed softly, because he had heard those words dozens of times growing up, yet standing inside the old machine shed with rain falling steadily outside and a finished harvest resting safely in the grain bins, they no longer sounded like another one of Thomas Carter's familiar sayings. For the first time since the day the 2 tractor keys were placed on the lawyer's desk, Daniel quietly wondered whether his father had been teaching lessons about people all along, and had simply chosen machinery as the easiest way for his sons to remember them. 5 years passed almost without either brother thinking about the sealed envelope their father had left behind, because life has a way of placing old questions quietly in the background, while new responsibilities demand every hour of the day. By the autumn of 2003, however, the lawyer's office once again became the place where the Carter family gathered, and as Daniel and Luke walked through the familiar doorway together, both men found themselves remembering the afternoon they had stood in the very same room, holding 2 tractor keys that neither of them had truly understood. The lawyer welcomed them with a warm smile before reaching into his desk and placing a single unopened envelope between them, explaining that Thomas had insisted it remain sealed for exactly 5 years because he believed some lessons could only be understood after they had first been lived. Luke carefully opened the envelope and handed the letter to Daniel, who immediately recognized the steady handwriting that had filled so many machinery manuals, seed records, and notes around the old farmhouse throughout their childhood. Thomas began by telling his sons that if they were standing together while reading the letter, then the most important part of his plan had already succeeded, because keeping a family together would always matter more than keeping a farm together. He reminded them that land could be divided, machinery could be replaced, and harvests would come and go with the changing seasons, but once brothers stopped trusting one another, No lawyer, banker, or inheritance could ever truly repair what had been lost. Thomas then admitted something that surprised both of them, because he wrote that he had already known which tractor each son would choose long before the will was ever written. Daniel had always believed the future belonged to those willing to embrace better tools and greater efficiency, while Luke had always believed that understanding a machine was just as important as owning it. And Thomas explained that neither of those instincts was wrong. What would have been wrong, he wrote, was allowing either son to believe his own way was complete without learning something from the other, because every successful farm needs both the courage to move forward and the wisdom to understand what already works before replacing it. As Daniel continued reading, Thomas explained that the tractors themselves had never been the inheritance because they were only the teachers he had chosen for each of his sons. One would teach the value of progress, while the other would teach the value of self-reliance. And if either brother spent the next 5 years believing his own lesson was the only one worth learning, then his plan would have failed. He finished the letter by writing that the greatest harvest he had ever hoped to leave behind wasn't measured in acres, machinery, or grain, because it would be the day both of his sons discovered they needed each other's strengths far more than they needed to prove whose choice had been right. When Daniel quietly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope, neither brother felt the need to say very much, because the answer they had been searching for since the afternoon of their father's funeral had never been hidden inside the John Deere or the old Farmall. It had been growing quietly through every decision they made, every season they worked apart, and every moment they chose to remain brothers before becoming competitors. And as they walked out of the lawyer's office together, both men understood that Thomas Carter's final lesson had never been about machinery at all. It had always been about the kind of men they would become after the inheritance was gone. The years that followed quietly confirmed what neither Daniel nor Luke had fully understood on the afternoon they chose their father's tractors, because the greatest changes rarely arrive all at once. They appear little by little, almost unnoticed, until one day a person realizes they no longer think the way they once did. Daniel still believed in modern machinery because he had seen firsthand how much good it could accomplish when used wisely, yet he also found himself spending more evenings inside the workshop than he ever had before, learning to understand the equipment he depended upon instead of assuming someone else always would. Luke, meanwhile, gradually welcomed new tools whenever they genuinely improved the farm, although he never forgot his father's belief that every new machine should increase a farmer's understanding rather than replace it. Without either brother trying to become more like the other, both men slowly discovered that their father's final lesson had quietly brought them closer together than they had ever been before. Neighbors noticed the change as well, because the Carter farms gradually became known as places where younger farmers could stop for advice without worrying about being judged. Sometimes they came with questions about machinery, sometimes about buying land, and sometimes simply because they faced difficult decisions that reminded Daniel and Luke of conversations they had once shared with their own father. Neither brother hurried to give answers because, almost without realizing it, they had both inherited Thomas Carter's habit of asking thoughtful questions first. Young farmers often arrived expecting simple advice, only to leave with a better understanding of the problem they had been trying to solve. And although many of them thanked Daniel or Luke for their wisdom, both brothers quietly smiled because they knew those lessons had never really belonged to them. One warm spring evening, several years later, Daniel stopped by Luke's farm just as the day's work was coming to an end and found his young nephew standing beside the old Farmall with a grease gun in one hand and a shop rag tucked into his back pocket. The little tractor still wore its faded paint with quiet pride, And although newer equipment now handled much of the heavier work around the farm, Luke refused to let the old machine become nothing more than a decoration because it still had honest work left to do. Daniel leaned comfortably against the workshop doorway while the boy finished greasing the last fitting, and as Luke walked over, he looked at his son with the same calm expression their father had worn so many times before. Instead of asking whether the maintenance was finished, Luke simply asked what the tractor was trying to say today, and the boy smiled before answering that it sounded fine. Luke nodded gently before encouraging him to listen a little longer, because every good machine has something to say if a farmer is patient enough to hear it before a small problem becomes a large one. Daniel couldn't help smiling as he listened, because for a brief moment he no longer heard his younger brother speaking. He heard Thomas Carter, and it suddenly became clear that although his father had been gone for many years, the lessons he planted were still growing in another generation. Perhaps that's the real reason the old Farmall remained on the Carter farm long after newer and larger machines arrived, because it was never simply an old tractor. It became a reminder that the most valuable things we inherit are rarely the things we can park inside a barn or record on a balance sheet. Land changes hands, machinery wears out, and every generation eventually passes the work to the next one. But patience, humility, integrity, and the willingness to keep learning are the kinds of inheritance that grow stronger each time they are shared. Thomas Carter understood that long before his sons did, and in the end, the greatest harvest he ever produced wasn't measured in bushels or acres. It was measured in two brothers who learned that becoming better farmers mattered far less than becoming better men. I'd love to hear what you think about this story. If you had been sitting in that lawyer's office, which key do you believe you would have picked? And do you think Thomas Carter's lesson changed the way you look at success, work, or even family? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from, because it's always a pleasure seeing this community come together from farms, ranches, small towns, and cities all around the world. If stories like this are the kind you enjoy, I'd love to invite you to join us by subscribing, because here on The Last Acre, we share a brand new story every single day, each one inspired by the timeless values, unforgettable people, and quiet lessons that have shaped rural America for generations. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on The Last Acre, where every acre has a story, every field remembers, and the quiet lessons of yesterday still have the power to shape tomorrow. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story.